I think we'll go ahead. All right, thank you everybody for joining us. I think we'll go ahead and we'll start with John, find out what his needs are and what he needs to have us accomplish tonight, and then we'll jump right into the policies. And then we will look over the research methodology or the analysis methodology that I put
All
together,
right.
and see what your thoughts are.
So tonight we have at second reading policy ADF, which is a school district commitment to learning results, which we looked at last time and edited, and then Kathy sent it back out again as edited. And then HBGA, here's Lauren, is homeschooling participation in school program, which is also at second reading. Hi, Lauren.
Hey there.
And we edited that policy and Kathy sent it back out again as edited. Then at a first reading, this review would be GCFB-R, which is recruiting and hiring of administrative staff, administrative procedure. And then we have evaluation procedures for hourly employees, and then the form for hourly employees. So, Jason, if you like, we could start off with just ADF and see if anybody has some further thoughts on editing that policy.
Sure, I'll pull it up. All right, can everybody see it?
That's better. If you could enlarge it just a little bit, that would be helpful. That's good.
All right, I think I can go up one more.
Great.
So yeah, it looks like the corrections were accepted, and this is in the the second reading. So the board has not given any groundbreaking directives on this policy. So I don't really see any issues with it. We can go ahead and move it to the second reading, which will finalize the policy once the board accepts it.
Okay.
Are
Move.
there any questions?
Sounds good.
Concerns?
No questions from me.
Reading. That's pretty straightforward.
All right, we'll move to the second one. Can everybody see this one? The homeschool policy, homeschooling
Yep.
policy? Excellent. Good. This was a bigger policy. The board, I do remember that the board discussed this, and they expected that students that were being homeschooled would have access to some portions of the classes or the facilities to meet their schooling needs. I don't recall that there was any particular change to be made to this policy after the first reading. Does
Yeah,
anybody have any questions or concerns on this policy?
The only thing I did, I was asked last time to check into whether if a homeschooled student who's just participating in sports needs to have the same vaccinations as other students, and they do.
Mhm.
That's not a part of the policy of this policy, it's part of the vaccination policy, but I did find that out.
Okay. But it's captured in the vaccination policy.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we're all set for this policy then, unless there are any other questions or comments.
Nope. It's good.
Excellent. We will move this to second reading, which will finalize the policy.
Great.
All right, the next policy was GCFBR, and I don't remember making any corrections to this.
This one we set aside
Yes.
at our last meeting and did not take it up. Let me find it. Here it is. So this is kind of a first run through for us really with this policy.
Right.
I do have some questions, but I want to let everybody else go first.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts, if I may share them. The first one is on the probationary period. It says that it has to be done within a year. That seems to me to be very generous. I think certainly my experience is that if you're gonna, you find out a lot very early on in the employment of someone, right? Am I looking at the right one here? I am. Oh no, I was looking at the evaluation one. I'm so sorry. Strike that. Strike that. I was no, I know which one we're talking about here. This is
no worries, no worries.
I beg your pardon. We're on the hiring of admin staff. I've got no issues with this. Sorry.
Jesse, Lauren, Jillian.
Fine.
Is this is the policy that we had talked about doing? There was like an element of blind
Screening, yeah.
screening. Is that right?
We talked about that. We hadn't
Yeah.
actually put the language in it.
Yeah. Did we want to put the language in there? Or do we want to just leave it open?
Well, I think maybe one way of sort of threading this particular needle, Jesse, would be to say that it's got it talks about using an approach that ensures there's no bias and so on. And maybe, that is one of the practices that can be deployed if chosen. I don't know if you have to actually mandate that, but it could potentially just be the norm. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, it says it in the first section, right? Non-discriminatory practice.
Right, because the alternative is that you're going to start putting in another layer of process that might not make sense in certain circumstances, and it might be very burdensome.
So my question is, does this policy or has this policy gone through or been vetted by the union at all? Or does it fall under the union contract?
It does not. It's not under the either collective bargaining.
I mean, I'm okay with it. I don't know how others are. Has anyone got an issue with it?
I don't.
Okay, we could put it up for first reading and see what the board says. I'm sure there'll be discussion on this one. So, and I'll try to take a closer look at it in the interim. Okay, so we're going to move this one forward for first reading.
I've got it.
Excellent. All right, so let's pull up the next one. I'm looking for it. All right, I think this is it.
Yeah, I don't want to, create a lot of work here, but I just want to make a couple of points. The first one is that the evaluation period, probationary period, isn't specified in 2A, except to say it's less than 12 months. That seems to me to be very lenient or generous or whatever you want to call it. My experience is if you have a problem, you really want to find it out as quickly as possible. So the probationary period should be pretty intense and pretty, maybe, I mean, I don't know, maybe leaving it at 12 months doesn't mean you can't get rid of a unwanted person within a few weeks if necessary, but I don't know. Is that,
Well,
yeah, I guess
the 12-month period would be, they would remain probationary for.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, gotcha. I'm sorry. I'm looking at things back to front. No, that it makes perfect sense, and you've got a generous amount of time in which to decide whether or not you want to get rid of the person. But I assume that nonetheless, it's the evaluation is pretty intense initially, just to make sure you haven't got a misfit.
It is, but we want to we don't really want to shorten.
No, I'm
that
sorry. Strike that from the record. Garbage on my part. I think it really was the second point that employees will be evaluated annually before the end of the year in the first, second, and third years of employment. In the second and third years of employment, it is so the norm is once a year, right? Not twice a year or more frequently.
It's once a year, but they would receive their formal evaluation, but they would be observed and given feedback, several times during the course of that year. So that's a summative evaluation.
And then in point C, they would then be evaluated every 3 years. Is that right?
With a summative. After 3 years, they would be evaluated every 3 years with a summative evaluation, unless the evaluator decides that they need a more frequent evaluation. In other words, if they aren't performing the way they should be, some issue, or they need an action plan or whatever, they can do that.
So presumably if their role changes, then the clock starts all over again and they start getting evaluated on an annual basis thereafter. But whilst they're in a role that they have experience in, the assumption is that every 3 years is okay. Have I got that correct?
If their job classification were changed, yes. So if they went from custodian to ed tech, so
Yeah.
that change in job classification.
So maybe we just need a bit more specificity there, because it says after 3 years of employment, which is a very generic term, right? Maybe it has to be employment in a specific role.
That could be, yeah.
I don't know if everyone agrees, but I just sort of noted that. And then in the next item, not using using the 0 or 1. I don't particularly like that approach. I just think the using the qualitative wording, whether it exceeds expectations or needs improvement or whatever or fails to meet the expectations, whatever it is that we use, instead of the 0 through 5, which aren't meaningful to me anyway. I just thought that was a better approach. I assume that's what we previously had. I'm wondering why we're.
Well, because it doesn't match up with the language of evaluation that we use. We're trying to be consistent with hourly employees and teaching staff as well, because we use a version of the Marzano model with teaching staff. And the reason we brought this to policy committee is because we wanted to just change this language so it matched up with our practices.
So the only issue is that it's a little bit arbitrary, right? I mean, you can what's 0 and what's 5 is good. Which end is good and which end is bad? You could, in middle of the year, switch everything around, invert it, and this would become meaningless, right? So I just felt like it was important to have some kind of specificity around what it is that it would trigger the intervention or action here.
Should we pull up the evaluation form to actually look at what the numbers mean?
Yeah,
we can. I mean, one of the things that I'm actually recommending is we take the form out of policy. And the reason I'm suggesting that is forms really oughtn't to be in policy, because every time we need to make any kind of a tweak to the form, which we do consult, and on this one, we do consult with the union.
Yeah.
We have anytime we'd have to make a tweak to the form, we'd have to bring it back to the policy committee, because it's actually in black and white in policy. So that's what's being recommended. And I don't know how people feel about that, but
procedure is normally separate from policy.
Okay.
I would agree with John on that.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I just have a little bit of trouble using an arbitrary number which is meaningless in the context of the policy statement. They're failing to meet expectations or failing to meet standards or not, whatever the criterion is, that triggers action, not 1 or 2, 0. That doesn't mean anything, right, in the policy statement.
Well, the policy does say that if you receive, what was it, like 4
Yeah.
twos or ones,
So
then there's a plan that's put into place.
if you, 4 ones, okay, 4 failing to meet expectations or whatever the language is, I would have thought that makes more sense. But and the other issue I've got is in my own career, there are certain criteria that if not met, you were instantly sort of, sort of cause for dismissal. And so it wasn't a, numeric performance about conformity with 3 or 4 criteria didn't matter if you failed to meet the standards in terms of your core values, meaning you were lying or cheating or doing something fraudulent. That was instant dismissal. So I kind of feel like this is a bit strange to me. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the idea that it's 3 or 4, that it might be one reason for getting rid of someone.
So the other thing that's operating here is the employee is working under a contract. So this is the policy for evaluation, but they're also operating under a contract. And in the contract, if you're going to dismiss an employee who is not probationary, it would either be for demonstrated continuing poor performance or cause.
Or
So
cause.
in your example, if an employee was stealing from the RSU, that's cause.
I see. So that doesn't need to be specified in this document, though.
No,
because that's covered by the contract.
Strictly for evaluation, but should an employee otherwise give us cause, whether they're stealing or I don't know, any other number of things that could be considered cause, they could be dismissed.
Okay, all right, then I apologize for wasting your time on that. Still got a bit of an issue with the 0 and 1. That's just seems weird to me. Doesn't mean anything. And as I said, what it's referring to could be changed, and then it everything's topsy-turvy.
I understand. It's the language of proficiency, which lines up with other things that we're doing, but
Well, it lines up with this right here, right?
correct.
Okay.
So, which is not something we made up.
Oh, I see. Oh, wow. Okay, I got it.
I see what you're saying, Paul. I would agree more with 1 through 5, Likert scale. But since this is established,
Then in which case, maybe it just simply makes reference to the Marzano scale. Okay, so 0 or 1 on the Marzano scale, and that
Right.
satisfies the requirement. Okay.
Okay. I agree.
so this policy is subject to collective bargaining, and has it been vetted by them?
Well, we haven't sent it to, we haven't sent the policy to first reading yet, but sometime between now and then, I'll take it to the union, and I don't believe that they'll have any issue whatsoever, simply because it's not a major change. And the form itself, which is hopefully coming out of policy, we have talked to them about, and they're fine with it.
Okay, so right now the form is part of the policy, like formally part of the policy.
Correct, and it's actually the wrong form. In other words, it's not a form that we want to continue to use, so we want the form that we use to line up with our Marzano plan. But we don't want it in the policy itself. But I wanted the policy committee to see it.
Okay, so what form are we going to use? And
That one.
Oh, this is the one. Okay.
Yes, I wanted the policy committee to see it. There's
Okay, so before first reading, you're going to take it over to collective bargaining, and then during first reading, we're going to ask the board to consider separating the procedure from the policy, and it will still remain part of the policy until the second reading.
correct.
And then it will be separated and finalized.
Correct.
Excellent. Is that what everybody else understands?
Yeah, I'm good with that. I never understood when I've seen forms below in policy before, why they're in policy. They
Yeah.
should just be forms that
Yeah.
do the policy.
Yeah, they don't belong in policy, really.
Yep.
I don't know why it's in there, but
So as a committee, we should keep an eye out for those kinds of
Yeah,
things.
I think so.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, so we will move this policy, evaluation procedures for hourly employees, to first reading.
okay.
And I thought this, did I make corrections to this one? No, it was the last one I didn't. All right, good. What else do we have that we need to discuss before we get to the analysis?
Those are all the policies that I have for tonight. So I guess it's up to the committee.
All right, should we transition? Okay, has everybody had a chance to look at this?
I have reviewed
You
it.
haven't had a chance, because I'd actually prefer that you didn't.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just reviewed it quickly, but yeah.
I actually haven't had a chance to look through it, Jason.
Okay, good. I'm sure this will be familiar, or portions of this will be familiar to most folks. So anyway, I would like to establish for the committee a formal process to review policies. And so this policy begins with the committee shall decide to use the analysis check sheet for each policy reviewed. As noted below, it shall never be assumed that this check sheet is used for every policy. So if John brings a policy to us and says, you know, this one was provided by the association, has been vetted by our attorneys, then we would all decide, well, this doesn't really need to go through this process, because it likely has already gone through those processes. But by having this piece of the checklist here, we can now say that we have a formal process for reviewing policies that come to the board. So does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
true.
So this policy follows the medical model, the research model, but is a little more in depth based on the experience of some inveterate policy writers, Bardock and Potashnik. And I put all kinds of other stuff in here that I would normally have for a policy analysis piece. So when we move on to define the problem, we really want to know what the policy solves. We have had policies come to the committee in the past, though it's very rare, that do not actually solve a problem or were a preventative policy. I'm actually against preventative policy because we could write those policies all day long. And it's how the state operates. When I was in mid-level management at DHHS as a licensing agent supervisor, we did not write preventative policies. So anyway, plus that you had to go through a promulgation process and the whole bit. But anyway, so what is the purpose of the policy? What issue should it address? And so there's space to write this down. Then what is the cultural framework? You know, what are we looking at? Are we looking at this through a Western mindset, a Southwest Asian mindset? You know, it could be any kind of culture per se. So, and that has some implications also. I mean, you know, so we want to make sure that we're not really targeting a certain group of people. What is the social framework? Social services, criminal justice, education, probably education will be more the social framework here. So we're going to want to know what's going on in education. But there could be a time where we're saying, you know, we're looking more at social services, or we're looking at counseling in the schools. So that might fall under counseling education or counseling services or social services. Who knows? But we can briefly go through. And this is at the 10,000 mile view. You could buy a book on every one of these steps or several books. So this is just a 10,000 mile high view. Identify your biases and make sure they do not influence your work. Obviously, this is one that I might struggle with a little bit. One of my biases would be I'm a parent, you know, so I might be thinking about this from the parent mindset. So I want to identify that and make sure it's not influencing my policy or my policy writing. of course, that does have, that sort of bias does have value. And I do think bias does have value. Then assemble some evidence is step number 2. In the research and medical model, this is always going to be the same. The literature review, you always do it. You do it throughout the entire process. Maybe you have experience with annotated bibliographies. I don't know. I like to read through journal articles, and I also like public databases. I especially like the main newsstand database. And in there, you can go in and you can look up like comments from students on policies that have been interviewed, superintendents, principals, and so forth. So it's really nice to get that personal picture about the policy. And then I included the university database in here also, but you can also, I think if you click it, will it take me there? All right, so it just takes me to USM. You can also go through, oh, I'm gonna have to go back. You can also go through the main state library. And you can access journal articles through there. You just set up an account. I think it's much easier than it has been in the past. The databases through the main state library are very similar to the university databases. You're probably going to have EBSCO and PsycInfo and all of those kinds of databases. And then, of course, we can check Maine School Management Association, Maine Principals Association is where I like to go and look at policies. I like to see what the Maine ACLU is doing to see if they have filed any lawsuits against boards. And so that's something I like to look at and form an opinion about or keep in the back of my mind as I do board work. So, I want to know for step 2, assemble some evidence. Did we consider these? John could come to us and say, well, we need to analyze this. But it came from the Maine School Management Association, and we might put it through this policy analysis process. Ethical considerations should be addressed here as identified in the literature. So normally, and I have this noted somewhere else, so normally in your literature review, you would have ethical considerations come up in journal articles. It's all a part of the research, so that should find its way here. Some ethical considerations are always going to be norms. Mores, when I say mores, I mean, what is typical, it's not really a law, but it should be a law. So that's what I mean when I say mores, and of course laws. When we can do policy analysis, but the law is the law and we have to follow it. And so that sort of directs us in this portion of the checklist. So again, this checklist sort of serves as a subtle reminder on what we need to look at. Okay, construct the alternatives. So obviously you need two alternatives to compare. One alternative is the status quo. It means not to do anything. We're just going to accept the policy the way that it is, or we're not going to make any changes to the policy that we're supposed to review. So we could check that block. Identify the mean average of outcomes or the primary outcome and mean average of constraints and simplest path to it. So we just want to look, what's the mental average of the results? And I'm not talking like though it could be quantitative, but qualitative. So for an example, might be that, we're looking to ban pet rocks in classrooms because they're disruptive. So we might pull the teachers for their alternatives. How do you deal with pet rocks in the classroom? And so we might have several alternatives, and then we'll try to mentally average those out. What are the commonalities between what the teachers are doing? And so that might be an alternative for us. So that would actually give us 2 alternatives: do nothing and then the average. I'll say it right here. Identify what others are doing. Identify similar policies. I think that as a board, we're particularly good at this. We have some board members that are great at looking and comparing policies across various districts. So I think it was Pete that did that quite a bit. So anyway, we would check that block here or provide comments. Some other alternative methodologies are to use the W.K. Kellogg logic model, and that's really basically the SMART philosophy. So it stands for specific, measurable, action-oriented, and realistic in time. So I have the page number and everything here. So everything here is referenced. So again, we would work our way through this. I think that's still under B. So this is, and then we come down here. Let's see, I've lost track here. Maybe I've got to revise this right here. No, right here, 1. Okay, 1, 2, identify other similar policies, and 3, use the Kellogg model. And then there's some more of the outline down here. Identify the secondary outcome and the simplest path to it. Identify what others are doing. So I'm just repeating the same thing down here. And then we can add our comments for comparison. Are there any questions so far? Am I losing anybody?
No.
Okay.
It's very similar to what we've done in qualitative research at the university so far.
Yes, good. So I really like this right here. Select the criteria. And so Deborah Stein has done this for us, and I have a video from her on that. And so we want to evaluate, or we could come up with our own criteria. And we don't have to follow all of these steps, and we could use some of them or all of them or none of them. So step 4, select the criteria. The 4 E's, effectiveness. Is the policy likely to work, or is the outcome goal achievable? Efficiency. Is the policy the best bang for the societal buck? And then I put this in here. Who is disadvantaged by equity? So who is disadvantaged by policy? And so I decided to reference Ibram X. Kendi, because in his book on how to be an anti-racist, he says that all policies disadvantage somebody. So I think that as we do our policy analysis, we need to look at and see if our policies are disadvantaging anybody. So I think that's a great question, good reference. Ease of political acceptability. How will government officials and other policy actors praise the acceptability of the policy? You know, I think that's common sense. You know, is the board going to agree to this? Are they not? Is this gonna pass the straight face test with the Department of Education, and on and on. And then we hit the ethical considerations again. I'm a huge fan of John Hooker and Michael Sandel. I think they're great ethicists. And so these principles basically come from them. If you've ever taken, if you have ever taken an ethics course in college, this should look familiar. So generalization principle, it's actually utilitarian, no, generalization principles. The reason for the action should be consistent with the assumption that everyone with the same reasons acts the same way. You know, so is a normal, reasonable person going to agree to this or accept this policy? Utilitarian principle. What is the greatest good for the greatest number, right? Classical utilitarianism. And then respect for autonomy, respect for freedom of actors. You know, how are we restricting people? So we want to take a closer look at that. So I think these are really good ethical principles, and I think that they capture a wide range of other ethics principles that ethicists have reviewed over the years. And again, you can review these videos. Michael Sandel's videos are fabulous. They're fun to watch. So I mean, grab a bowl of popcorn and have a seat and enjoy. Okay, project the outcomes. Test cases. Consider the problems that arise with a test case, population or manager. You know, so a test case might be an example. You know, we don't want to require all students to give up their pet rocks. What we want to do is implement a volunteer program and see how many students we have that are open to giving up their pet rocks in the classroom, and then see how that works. Maybe they can influence other students to put away their pet rocks. And then, of course, everybody's favorite part is to play devil's advocate. You know, and I think this is important. We used to do it in the military. We used to call it wargaming, where you would just tear each other's policies right down. And the whole idea was to, you know, build the perfect policy, the perfect plan. So I think this is a great way to get out of the group think mode. Confront the trade-offs. Test again by putting yourself in the shoes of each of those affected by the policy. Would you likely agree to these trade-offs? Why or why not? So again, I reference Kendi here, and I also reference Rawls. I like John Rawls because he has the veil of ignorance. You know, if you were born into this situation, would you want, what would your expectations be? So I think that's an important consideration. Am I losing anybody here?
No, this is fascinating. Keep going.
Okay. So, you know, I like this one right here. Stop, focus, narrow, deepen, and decide. You know, so we're talking about all that we've discussed, especially the alternatives. We need to decide and narrow it down. Think seriously about the politics of getting this alternative legitimated and adopted. Think seriously of the ongoing institutional features that will have the power and resources to implement the policy or program in the long run. You know, I hear it a lot, especially around school systems, that we need to make our decisions as if we had all of the resources and then worry about those resources. You know, here we're asking, you know, can we really support this policy with the resources that we have? What is the transition strategy? Who will sell the policy? The student, the teacher, administrator, and you know, this is a great place to identify some problems. We all know, those of us that have studied policy know that there is a disconnect between the policymakers and the actual implementation of the policy. So that's what we're trying to think about here. I wish I had referenced him down here because he's awesome. Jonathan Haidt, he's a social psychologist, and he really talks about selling the story. I can't think of what video it is, but anyway, he talks a lot about people make decisions based off of the qualitative stories. They very rarely make decisions based on the quantitative data. Of course, as policy analysts, we want to look at the quantitative data because that is what is going to guide us without error or little error or little variance. So ideally, you would want to sell your policy to someone invested in your work. Know your audience. I probably could reference Jonathan Haidt there. He did say that in one of his videos. Develop an elevated speech so that you can discuss the policy quickly and briefly in a short period of time, in case you were actually asked about it in an elevator or like places. So, you know, we want to have our elevator speeches ready for the board. And of course, you know, our board is great. We have a lot of smart people. I would anticipate a lot of questions on every policy that we brought to them. How are we going to publish the policy? You know, I think that's actually part of what we do as a committee here. You know, we're supposed to discuss our communications or how we're going to put information out. So again, you know, we can check block this and put our comments down. This was actually an afterthought after pulling this together. My friend, Kathy Kamab, who's the former director of DHHS, Division of Licensing and Certification. And she says that, you know, anytime that you publish a policy, you ought to have an appeals process. You know, maybe this is something we could take out because we may already have an appeals process in our policy somewhere. Do you know if that's true, John? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
We do not that I'm aware of anyway. I mean, I think there's always an appeal for something that would be decided as a result of a policy, but not the policy itself.
So that's something we might want to look at as we analyze our policies, or maybe even write up a separate policy. Well, I don't want to create work for anybody, but maybe write up a separate policy for an appeals process. I mean, obviously the appeals process, you know, is going to go through the administration up to the board if it goes all the way, and then, you know, it continues on up that chain, or to the Department of Education, and then it goes over to the Office of Civil Rights if there's disability issues, and on and on.
Can I, Jason, thanks. Can I need a clarifying question on that one.
Sure.
Would it be an appeals process of a policy only? And I'll tell you why I asked, because some policies, the superintendent's decision is the final word. right? So are you suggesting that if a policy says something like that, that could be appealed, or just the policy itself?
But I was thinking the policy itself, I don't see an issue. Well, obviously, I don't see an issue with the superintendent being the final appeals process or the final decision maker. I mean, that all makes sense to me. If I was a teacher and I was going to appeal a policy, I would probably start with my principal.
Yeah.
So I would expect that the supervisory chain would be the appeals process.
Right, that's fine, because in some instances, I could see the appeals going on and on and on if that were the case. And we don't want that. So, yep, I'm good.
We don't. We can either, I think this is okay. I think that after we analyze each process, we should talk about the appeals process. What does that look like? What are we going to do if somebody disagrees with this policy once it's passed? And it might be as simple as the superintendent is the final decision maker, and he's where all the appeals go to. As long as it's clarified, there's nothing worse than being subject to a policy without an appeals process and being
All right.
told it's just the way that it is. Get over it. All right.
Wow.
So these are the references for this, and some of them are pretty robust. Like I said, Sandel is pretty robust. I mean, that's a great book, by the way, if you haven't read it. But you can watch all kinds of videos. You can watch his Justice series through Harvard. Just Google it. They're incredibly fascinating. And if you're interested, you will certainly learn a lot that way. But I will tell you that the videos do model the book. So if you're not into reading any of this stuff, please go ahead and check out the videos. But like I said, you can buy books, several books on each step here and go really into depth. But that's not what I'm proposing here. I'm proposing a 10,000 mile view of our policies to make sure that we haven't forgotten anything. Is it a law? Is it a norm? Is it a more? Because sometimes the norm is the policy. And by publishing a policy to violate the norm, we're actually violating a policy. That's the norm. So anyway, what are your questions or comments? Is this something we're interested in? Do you want to reflect on it some more or make a decision on the next meeting?
Jason, I'm curious, is the idea that we all individually embrace this and kind of do our own work, or is it that the committee as a team kind of goes through this process just to make sure as a team and signs off essentially as a team on the process?
At the very least, I plan to do this in case somebody approaches me and say, "Hey, Jason, did you actually give this policy any thought?" And I can say, "Yeah, right here." So, I think that we can either do this as a team, and I will record the record, or we can do it individually. At the very least, I think that we should have this forum open as we look through policies to make sure we haven't missed anything. What is the law in regard to this policy? I mean, we want to make sure that we capture that. Or is it a norm? Or is it a more? Who's being disadvantaged? Are these questions that we've asked in the past? I'm not sure that we have. I think that all of us together have probably thought about many of these aspects as we analyze policies, but I want to make sure it's more formal. So when people ask questions, we can say, yes, we did look to see who was disadvantaged by this policy.
And is the idea that it should be deployed every time we address every policy? Because we've had a couple of fairly trivial ones through where it would be quite time consuming.
Yeah, so that's why I have this here in the beginning, and that's a great question, Paul, because I don't want to slow our process down to a screeching halt, which this checklist has the potential to do. So I think that at the beginning of every policy analysis that we do, we should ask the question, do we want to subject this to the the analysis checklist.
Okay.
It could be that John said, well, I got this from the Maine school management folks. Our attorneys looked at it. You know, it's been through an analysis process. We might decide not to use the checklist, but at least we have our own formal process to
Mhm.
discuss the policy. And just by asking that question, you know, it's part of a formal process.
No, I could see it being tremendously valuable when we start dealing with very hard policy items. The one which comes to mind immediately is the electronic use policy, where were we to revisit it, I could imagine many of these questions would come into play very quickly as an example. My last question actually is, there's no sort of room for public engagement in this process, and I'm not sure. Maybe we are the public here. We're the proxy for the public. But for instance, what if we were to go back out to the citizens of our town and solicit their opinion on a policy?
Yes.
Is that even appropriate in some cases?
That could be captured under the assemble some evidence. What you want to do is include your stakeholders.
Mm.
You know, so for example, I talked about going to the newspaper database, and in there that you see people conduct interviews with school officials and students all the time. So you can go in there and read main newspapers and grab student quotes and stuff like that. I am sensitive to going out and conducting personal research with constituents and students, especially for a person like myself, because I'm actually a researcher. I would be subject to the IRB, and I could get into a lot of trouble for that. So, as long as there was an indirect way, well, even then, when you I guess the only way to get stakeholder input would be to, request that at the board meeting, and those that are listening would put the input, constituents when they contact you. But I think actively going out and asking the question. I don't think, I think asking the school teachers, administration, all of those things are fine. Department of Education officials, and so forth. I really think that the best way to do that is through newsstand databases and looking at journal articles where meta-analysis have been conducted.
So when we've had an issue of one kind or another, maybe it's something that we really want to know what the public's opinion is. We have done lots of things like surveys, or we've had a hearing or some other thing. So
A hearing's good.
yeah, I wouldn't preclude the possibility that we might want to do that if we know that we really need to have some buy-in from the public and or the students on a particular policy. I don't think that would be inappropriate. Plus, these meetings are open to the public. When Kathy sends out the agenda, the Zoom link is on the agenda for everybody. It's an open link, so anybody can join if they choose to. And at times, the teachers union has actually joined the meetings and given input right then and there. So
I think all of those things are okay. But I think conducting a survey, if we got together, put together a survey and then sent it out and then publish that information, that's where the concern comes in. And IRB boards, which are open to the public, so any one of us could submit an IRB proposal, institutional review board proposal. And the sole purpose of that is to make sure that people are not harmed and that vulnerable populations are not harmed. So that is the criteria, I believe, for soliciting stakeholder input. But all of the things you mentioned, John, I think are fine. I think once you conduct a survey and then put that together, either in a journal article or some sort of report, and put it out to the public, you might start getting into some muddy water there. I know that that's not something I would agree to.
Yeah.
But
So-
I know there have been surveys that have gone out to the board, or, if you're a superintendent and you want to know what's going on with the teachers and you put together a survey, those things are different. That's not actual research surveys that we're going to publish
Right.
to the public. I don't know. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, just some comments from me. So I said I've used this process in research problems to some extent. It's a little different than some of the things I've done, but I've never done it in terms of policy. So I'm actually kind of curious to see how it might work in certain cases. My only reservation is something that you brought up, and that is, I think we want to make sure that we don't get, kind of buried in doing this. But the way you've explained it, I'm not really worried about that, at least me personally.
Yeah, good.
Me neither. I like it, Jason. I think it's terrific terrific structure, as long as we're prudent in the way we use it.
I think so. I think we'll have to monitor each other. If one of us comes to the board and we've got, $1,000, 1,000 pages of research, we might want to say, hey, we should could you just summarize that research? What's the summary of that, or something to that extent?
I just think, Jason, you put this together, right? You didn't find it somewhere and give it. You put all this together for us to consider as a checklist, right?
I did, and it was based partially on a course that I teach. I took that outline, and then, I thought it was only going to take me a few minutes to put together, but actually it took me 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, so I want to thank you for working hard to put this together. It's fantastic. I think that you could yourself, as chair of the committee, trigger, doing this checklist. Any one of us could recommend that to you. And then I think it might work best if you go through it on your own, and then you bring that and you bring it up on screen and we talk about it and just go over each of those items on the checklist together, following your recommendations or ideas until we get to the end point where we figure out what we're going to do. That might be a process that is both feasible and efficient.
I agree. And I was at the minimum, at the very least, that's what my plan was.
Yeah. Because like you said, we don't need it for every policy, but on the ones we need it, we need to do it together. But if you start the process and lead us through it, because you know this stuff really well, I think that'll be very, like I said, efficient and effective.
All right, good, excellent.
I'm happy with that too. I mean, I would say the bulk of the policies that we end up considering are required policies. Most, if not all of them, are vetted through MMSA or the attorney or the attorneys. But I think this is great. I have no issue with this whatsoever.
It also helps us describe those kind of policies that need this kind of review, describe it well to the board as to what we as a committee have done and reviewed and are bringing to them.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Any other questions or comments before we end our meeting?
Not for me. All good.
Do you guys want to take some time before, excuse me, we skipped this part, before we make a final decision on this, or do we want to discuss it at the beginning of the next meeting, or do we just want to accept it? And again, we've already said it several times. We don't have to implement it on every policy. We can decide that yes or no.
I think we can go ahead and do it and just, again, follow your lead on this and do it together when we meet to discuss this kind of issue, this kind of policy.
Excellent.
Agreed.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your participation. And thank you for your attendance. Unless there are any other questions or concerns, I will go ahead and end the meeting.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank
All
you.
right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jason.
Take care. You're welcome.